the idea was really that when I prepared my career proposal, I had help from people, and that was really invaluable. I was totally at a loss. I didn't know how was that different from an unsolicited proposal, what are the things I had to pay attention to, et cetera, et cetera. And I was incredibly grateful for that help. And sort of once I received it, I sort of reflected on how could I don't know, pass on maybe this gift that had been given to me. And so I asked these friends and colleagues of mine whether they would be willing to help me share some of that limited knowledge that we have gained through this process. In the interest of time, I don't want to talk much more, but I do want to go around and introduce the panelists. Before I do so, I just wanted to say real quick that because we're a lot of people, and I'm sure there's a lot of questions, I asked the panelists to give succinct answers as much as that's possible. And also to remember and to remind y'all that the purpose is not so much to reflect on how to write a general proposal, but how the career proposal may be different from an unsolicited proposal. I think all panelists and myself would probably agree that we have no problem at all for you interrupting us and asking questions in between. I trust that that will be a pretty organized process. If it wasn't, then I guess we'll sort of have reflect on how we can do this differently. I think the idea also is that this is sort of a free-flowing conversation, so relatively unstructured. If for some reason people don't have questions, I had prepared sort of standardized questions based on some of the feedback you had given through the forum, and I shared that with the panelists, and then we can sort of discuss those questions. But presumably you have questions, otherwise I guess you probably wouldn't be here necessarily. With all this being said, maybe we start with Kristin to introduce herself, Trevor, and then I'm not sure we have Daniela, our third panelist here, but if she's here, then she would be. Hey, awesome. Sorry, there's so many faces I couldn't see her. Anyways, with all that being said, maybe Trevor, you start out by briefly introducing yourself, maybe a name, home institution, year you were awarded, and maybe how many tries it took you, because normalizing failure, I think, is a healthy part of being an academic these days.
Okay, yeah, I'll happy to start. Yeah, so my name is Trevor Lujan. I'm at Boise State University in Mechanical and Biomedical Engineering Department. I was awarded my career in 2016, so it's probably the oldest of the people that are here. And I'm in my no-cost extension year. It took me 2 tries to get the award. So I think that's all you want right now, right, Manuel? Okay.
Do you want me or Daniela? I guess I'll go. Hi, I'm Kristin Miller. I'm an associate professor at Tulane University. I was awarded my career award in 2018, and due to intensive mentoring and feedback, I was able to get mine in try 1.
Hello, everyone. Daniela Valdez-Jasso, University of California, San Diego. I just got this year my award. It was at the 3rd trial that I got my grant. So, NSF CAREER.
I'm Manuel Rausch. I'm at UT Austin. I got mine this year as well, together with Daniela, also on my 2nd try. I also want to highlight that everybody who got it here got it through BMMB. And so I forgot to mention that earlier, that was a specific purpose, because all the career events that I had attended were actually general and very general sometimes. And I was hoping that we would be able to give some specific feedback or maybe insight into the process through BMMB. I thought to start out the conversation, one of the questions that probably many of you have is how the career award is different from an unsolicited NSF award, or the proposal for this award. And so I thought maybe I start with Kristin and have her share with you how she thinks the research component may be different from an unsolicited proposal. And then maybe have Trevor go into how the broader impact may be different between an unsolicited and a career.
Sure. So I guess one of the first differences is it's actually a 5-year grant. So most of the unsolicited are 3 years. So the scope is a little bit different. And also the advice that was given to me is that you really are proposing like your entire kind of career development path. So there usually is a separate section that actually kind of talks about your past story and how the research that you're proposing will basically give you the platform to be able to establish and maintain your faculty position. So it really is an opportunity to try and argue how you can mark your turf, if you will. That's my thing for the research. Yeah.
Actually, if you mind, I would like to elaborate on that too, because it's one thing important to realize is at the time that I've written the NSF CAREER, I've gotten AHA grants, my an R01, and now this NSF CAREER. But the one different thing is that, as Kristin says, you know, you can't really emphasize, it's really about your career path, and the fact that it's an award, it's about you. So you can have letters of support from people that are going to guide you, but it's really about you and you and you. Whereas the other funding mechanisms that I've had are really about maybe how you're going to get sort of things done in a way. So just that's like important difference.
Yeah, and Daniela also kindly reminded me when we talked about, so in addition to potentially a paragraph kind of telling your story, a lot of times, or I included, and it was suggested to me to actually include like a 15-year timeline. So like a figure that actually talks about like what you'll do in the 5 years of the career award, but then to potentially talk about how that will then enable you to have these other projects ongoing. So it really is like your story that you're selling.
I'd like to mention that I actually had Kristin's career proposal, and she was really kind to share it with me. So I kind of mimicked hers actually to quite an extent, which didn't go too poorly for me. So I'll definitely listen to Kristin.
I think, Manuel, you wanted me to mention broader impacts. Yeah, I guess from my experience, you know, I've submitted a lot of NIH grants, but this was the only NSF grant I'd submitted. So I don't have a perspective in terms of the 3-year grants. But, you know, one thing with the broader impacts, of course, there's the educational component, which, you know, I think ideally is nicely integrated with your research. But I think another big factor is kind of really emphasizing that transformative nature of this grant and how it then plays into your career. And I was looking at some of the reviews I got, and I think one of the reviews that I got consistently was to make sure that it wasn't just about medicine, which, you know, in BMMB it is, but to also make sure that it is really looking at the fundamental advances in biomechanics and mechanobiology. So really focusing on the science. So I think that was something that was different for me versus NIH grants.
I should mention real briefly that I had asked all the panelists to actually go back and look at their feedback that they had gotten for their careers, and to kind of try to distill whether there was something that was generally perceived as good and generally perceived as maybe not so good, as sort of a close or first approximation to sort of a general truth. So if you have questions in that regard, I think if the panelists did their homework, they'll have that information for you.
So I'll start just because, again, mine is relatively recent. I would say that one of the things that I was criticized in my first 2 trials was that I wasn't really going for a mechanism. So the one thing is that I know, and it was always confusing to me, when should I send a grant to NIH versus to NSF, right? And they always tell you, oh, NSF doesn't care about the medical aspect. It's not true. It's like, because even NIH sometimes may really want basic science, right? So, but what they were very interested in, the criticisms that I got were in especially the second time, was that the mechanism wasn't clear, and there wasn't like a good connection between my objectives throughout my grant. And so there was this sort of discontinuity part of that was not being well set. Ironically enough, the last year, I basically started writing last 2019 summer, a grant, my NSF, that eventually I thought, oh, this is actually really good. I should maybe try to give it for my R01. And then, but then I've been back to basically NSF. And somehow working through that process, because at least I've been sort of trained about how NIH works, about being very like, very mechanistic based, that it really helped lift up my NSF career and addressing that part. The other thing I can mention while you guys have your attention is the whole education part. I had gone through the fact of like basically coming up with a huge new project or program, right? Like saying, okay, this is all the stuff that exists in my institution. This is what I'm going to add. And they were like, great, but you're not applying your science. And one of the misunderstandings, and actually I'm also might say that I did serve in NSF career panel, and served in as an NSF reviewer, even before getting one. So that also helped me. So if you volunteer, that's actually also a really good way. And that way you can also find out that it's not true that NSF and NIH reviewers are different, because they're not, because 90% of the people that were sitting with me in NSF career panels, they were actually from NIH. And so, and probably you guys know a lot of this person that I think it's amazing, like Jim Bassingway. He's like 100% NIH guy. He was there. So do not think that they are completely different. They're not. But anyways, they basically wanted to see my science directly being applied in my classroom for my outreach specifically. They didn't care whether I came up with a whole new program or you piggyback in one program. It was more like what you're learning from the basic science, from the mechanisms that you're investigating. How are you going to be putting those to, how are you really going to be applying that? And I think that was what also helped me on the one that I finally got, that, if suddenly everything sort of clicked and was tied together. And I think that's one of the things that a lot of times people miss.
Just a super quick note. I think what Daniela has said about the closeness between the BMMB program and the NIH is one of the reasons why I think or thought a specific BMMB panel would be helpful, because my sense was from other friends that applied to other programs that sort of closeness makes this program a little different from maybe MOMS or other fairly closely related program within the NSF.
So I guess some pieces of advice that were given to me that I found helpful, and one, as while BMMB and some aspects of the NIH are similar, we still have to remember that the NSF still wants like fundamental basic science and engineering. So usually you have to have like a specific engineering development that's enabling you to identify that mechanism, or so it either needs to be a tool or some sort of basic science finding that can then be applied back to all of mechanobiology. So I think a past program officer recommended to one of my friends the question of like, can this be applied to plants, right? Doesn't mean the answer is not, my work's in the reproductive system, doesn't apply to plants, right? But we can take some of the basic science structure function, or for example, some aspect of a mathematical model or something that you're innovating in your research niche that can then be applied to other aspects of mechanobiology. And so I think selling that, so I guess I would say it's quite similar to the NIGMS kind of aspect, or some things of NIBIB within the NIH, that you have to argue how it's potentially advancing your medical problem, but then mapping back to the fundamental engineering aspect. Towards the wonderful words spoken by Daniela about the kind of interface between the research and the broader impacts. Sorry, you're gonna get sick of me saying make a figure, but I do think the closer your grants are to graphic novels, the less grumpy your reviewers are. So, but potentially for the career award in particular, it's not just like training, like incorporating this in your class and maybe doing like 1 K through 12 outreach. It is a significant broader impact component that, as Daniela said, can also build on things at your institution. So I think the things that were brought to me is, one, it has to integrate, and I would make a figure that shows how your research aims connect to your broader impact aims. Can be really helpful to show how you'll take those basic science findings and incorporate them in some way into your educational objectives. The second is that while you can build on things in your institution, you have to argue why you as a unique human will contribute to that broader impacts in a way that someone else can't, right? Which usually is because of your research findings or something like that. The third is for the career award. From my understanding as an applicant and a reviewer, it's absolutely imperative that you evaluate your broader impacts objectives. So that can be things like surveys through your K through 12 outreach. If you're making an open source mathematical model, there are a bunch of fancy tools now that can like track like how many hits you have or how many people have downloaded it. You can even make like a unique DOI that will like cite your code for like whatever your tool is to like track use and your footprint and that sort of impact. But the reviewers are really looking for that, ideally quantitative, but at least some sort of qualitative things that you can include in your annual report of how successful your broader impacts was. Yeah, I had something else, so I forgot. So I'll let Trevor speak.
Yeah, I was just going to add to what you just said, Kristin, about the assessment was something new for me for writing these grants. Is that for the outreach educational component is I wanted to include some quantitative assessment of how the outreach was going, and so I worked with the teaching center that's at Boise State, and I guess hopefully your university might have something similar, and talk to somebody who has expertise in that. That's all they do is try to create metrics out of educational data, and I think getting some of those the nomenclature and the best practices from that person saved me a lot of time and really kind of added a nice professional touch to that part of the grant.
It's funny because I also had Trevor's proposal, so I definitely learned from him in that. And Kristin is like, you basically wrote a proposal by numbers, which is pretty much what I did. I actually learned from him, and I did the same thing here. And it's actually not cheap. So I don't know whether people are generous at your university, but so I have an external evaluation plan in my proposal. It's about a third of a page, and they budgeted $15,000. To externally evaluate both my research progress as well as my evaluations. But for that, they create surveys, they do qualitative and quantitative interviews, and they write reports that you can then submit with your annual review. I'm not saying you necessarily need to do that, but the year that we submitted, they increased the budget from $500,000 to technically unlimited, but practically, if you talk to a program director, they tell you that if you budget one summer month, as well as one student, as well as the reagents and materials you need, that's the number that's going to be acceptable. And so in my case, that was around $570K. And so I included in that a budget of, I think, about $15,000 for this external evaluation. I just thought I'd throw that out there as a reminder also that the budget is not capped at $500K in BMMB anyways.
Yeah, so that's really helpful. So I can say, I guess I was really lucky that I had like a random conversation with someone in our psychology department at Tulane who happened to like have like an like she had like a small sub branch of her research that was to like use surveys on the K through 12 side to look at things like science and role model identity. And so I was lucky to find a collaborator that, as Daniela mentioned earlier, can be one people to write a letter of support. But I'll also say that like that is she has publications that if any of you are interested in like doing or following those things, I'm happy to like send you those references, as that's something that you can potentially include as they're basically they're called Likert style evaluations, but it's like the course evaluation, like 1 through 10 sorts of things of a series of questions. That's actually like a part of her research to try and see and identify how women and underrepresented minorities benefit from those things. So Manuel's is probably much better, but this is a free option just in case you have a bunch of expensive science sorts of things. But it's a perfect opportunity. That was also suggested to me that while this is your career, you do want to search for people at your institution or other aspects to write you letters of support to help fill in those gaps, right? To like help strengthen your application and just show that there's a community coming around you to like help you complete this sort of aspect. And so the classic example that was shown to me was that like, if you're predominantly an experimentalist and you're including some modeling, to have a letter of support from a modeling person or vice versa, right? But there might be people at your institution in like psychology or other things that might be able to help with some of your broader impacts evals.
To come back to the theme of things that were universally good and universally bad, I also took a look at my feedback this morning. What I found was actually interesting was that my feedback looked much worse for that round than my previous one that didn't get funded. So the previous round, I got secondary consideration, and really nobody really seemed to have any particular issues. But I think overall the sense was lack of excitement. And I think generally speaking, it's always a little frustrating when you feel like I'm doing robust science. Does there need to be excitement? And I think from a scientific perspective, not necessarily maybe, but I think from a grant reviewer's perspective, it just is easier to like something that gets you excited because it's innovative or clever or presents some new perspective on something you hadn't really considered. So the second time around, I actually got a lot of controversy. Literally, my summary says that my proposal had created rich controversial discussions that surrounded the idea whether thrombus should be tested in vitro or in vivo. And I proposed in my first round in vivo, in my second round in vitro. And so in the end, I got very good reviews, clearly. So I don't think necessarily creating that sort of subject-specific controversy was a bad thing. But people overall applauded the idea that my outreach was ambitious, while also criticizing that it was probably too ambitious. And the science was too fundamental, while also being too applied. So I got to be honest, in the end, the reviews were very, very much in disagreement. But what I think primarily I learned from it was that that was not necessarily a problem. So people could disagree with my approach while appreciating its value outside of them necessarily exactly feeling that's what they would have done. But what was universally applauded in my outreach was that I had just put a lot of effort into it. And that I had, for example, looked through references, right? There's people that dedicate their careers to doing research in outreach subjects. And I had read the literature and cited the literature and sort of designed my outreach projects surrounding sort of evidence-based ideas, as opposed to just kind of having a good feeling about something that could be good for someone. And I think that was sort of the only thing that I can universally say people liked, that I had really based it on sort of research and I had done the groundwork and talked to educators and people that I would have integrated. And I do want to highlight, and I'm not necessarily thinking that that made a big difference, but I did have 11 letters of support. And I've heard that other people didn't have that, but basically anytime I feel like something was not necessarily my expertise, I asked someone with name recognition to write a letter. So I used FEBio and I asked Jeff Weiss and Gerard Eteshian to write letters of support. I had a STEM outreach project and I asked someone here who did research in STEM outreach to write a letter. And I'm not saying it's necessary, but I'm also saying nobody complained about me having too many letters, and people had commented on me having a good support system. Again, this is anecdotal and I'm not saying that this must be done.
Yeah, I'm just gonna say that on contrast, I think I had 2 or 3. And so again, I don't think there's necessarily like a specific rule. And just do be aware that with NSF, it's literally a 1-sentence thing that says me, so and so agrees to whatever Daniela wrote on her grant, and that's it. Like it's nothing more specific than that. So it's not. So I mean, they recognize them as being support, but it's not a specific type letter.
Do we want to take a quick pause from sort of the directed conversation and see whether anybody has any questions about what we've discussed so far? I think you can just unmute yourself and speak up. I think that'll work just fine.
Yeah.
Hello, Manuel. I have a question, please. Can I start? Thank you very much for putting this together. I think this is great. So essentially, I would like to ask you guys' opinions about so the five-year program or like projects versus the 100,000 budget a year. What can you? So, do you propose an idea that definitely needs more money than that? And then you can have like the reviewer saying this is unfeasible with this budget, or do you kind of like tailor your idea of the science itself, the project itself, to like a much smaller and feasible project with this amount of money? So what is kind of like your ideas in terms of kind of like not proposing too much there is not feasible with the money versus proposing too little because you are capped at 100K about that per year? And how do you plan forward so well with so little money?
So,
Trevor, oh, sorry.
oh, okay. Oh, sorry. Yeah, Jean, I think basically, I mean, clearly, actually, you're never going to be able to cover. I will never be able to cover like maybe just a third of what I proposed with the budget that I was them given. Because really, it turned out for me to be just half a summer salary for me, one grad student, and some reagents and some money for my outreach programs. So it's very little, and everybody knows that. So here, what you want to think more about it, it's really there. It's an award. It's not necessarily a grant per se, in the sense that they're going to give you the money to carry it out. And again, it's really, it's again, just think about it. It's an award about how your career is going to be moving forward, or how the science community gives you a stamp supporting your trajectory.
Sorry, Trevor, I was calling on you only because I know that you have primarily applied for NIH funding, where obviously the budget is much larger. So I was wondering how you sort of navigated a project that naturally you may have thought would be more appropriate for the NIH for a limited budget like that.
Yeah, and I've almost spent all the money. So yeah, I guess my advice would be to err on a bit more ambitious versus trying to be right on target with the amount of manpower and materials that you might have the budget for. One piece of advice that was really helpful when I was applying was that you don't have to include this in your budget, but once you get the career award, you can get two undergraduate students a year through the REU program, which is an extra $16,000 a year. And so I had actually undergrads on my grant originally, and they told me to take them off and just get them funded with this supplement. So in addition to the 500K or whatever I got, every year I've got an extra 16K to help fund those undergrads. So that helped a bit in trying to actually work through the goals of my grant. But I thought that was good advice by Manuel, is like a month's summer salary, a PhD student or a graduate student, and then the materials you need, I think is probably a good place to start. And if you don't think you can get the work done, I think you're more likely to be told you're not doing enough than you're doing too much. And if you are being told you're doing too much, they might not fault you too much for that. I don't know if Kristin, Daniela, or Manuel has any comment on that.
Yeah, I mean, I have yet to meet a person who got a career award who didn't go into a no-cost extension. So, like, I think we tend to propose on the ambitious side, right? As well as the fact that one of the other kind of key differences from my experience of NIH versus NSF is that the boundary preliminary data for the NSF is generally quite low. Like, you're just kind of proving like remote feasibility and technical capability. And for me, like, you could really propose like your hopes and dreams. So the chance of like high risk, high reward, but also potentially that things take longer to get like them to work is definitely a possibility. I would reiterate what everyone else has said as far as the one summer month and the one grad student. I think we will all admit it takes away, it's usually like very understaffed as far as it's usually much more work than one graduate student. And then I would try and make sure that, whatever the base fundamental aspects, right? So that you can get enough work done on whatever your fundamental science or engineering kind of inquiry, like you need to have enough money in the supplies to at least cover like that cornerstone, right? To establish that towards the end. But you know, things always cost more than we think they do, and it's just part of how you've got to make it work. So
I remember from my first application that they mentioned something about, I think I requested buying, I can't remember. I asked for some specific in my budget, and they, the reviewers are basically, where is her startup money? Right, that should be covering that. So again, the reviewers do have that in mind, that yes, this is gonna to propel you forward, but that you're starting with a baseline startup, and maybe and have other sources of funding. So again, they're not expecting you to get everything done through this budget.
I think, I'm not sure I took a different route, but I definitely was aware of this issue from the very start. And so when I started my job here at UT, I very quickly realized I didn't really have a good idea for the NSF career. And the reason was that a lot of my work required collaboration with clinicians or large animal labs. And after talking to some of my mentors, they said, well, it's problematic if the success of your proposal to a large degree depends on someone else. And so I very early on sort of like wrecked my mind over a project that I could do independently and within a relatively limited budget. And so I definitely planned and structured the entire sort of problem I was trying to address to fit that funding format. And so I think in that, I think mine is relatively realistic for the budget that I proposed. In fact, I do think it's realistic. But that also kind of brings us to another question, which I know that a lot of people have and have expressed, which is how much preliminary data do you need? And I'm going to just take it because I'm already speaking anyways. And I just want to say that because I had planned this for a fairly long time and then also didn't get it the first time around, I definitely had quite a bit of preliminary data, which then also makes it more realistic, right, to finish the proposal within the time frame. And that I think I definitely had about 20 to 25% of the work done that I proposed in my actual proposal. And I'm not sure that's necessary, but that is sort of where I was at. And I definitely had some data for every aspect of the research that I proposed. It may have just been a feasibility study. It may have just been a form of demonstration that the technique I'm planning to use, I have used. And in some other instances, I think I had 2 papers that directly related to what I was proposing. I'm not sure what the experience for everybody else was in terms of how much data you had and how much data you think you needed.
I had also quite a bit of data. But again, I mean, at least let me put it this way. I always had a figure for every objective. Yeah.
Yeah, I also had a preliminary study section for every goal that I laid out. And I think just convincing the reviewers that you can do the work, that goes a long way. And that's kind of the goal, I think, of that preliminary part of the study.
Yeah, so I'm probably on the shallower end. So I agree with Daniela's comment that in general, like I had at least like a figure of some sort of support or feasibility. But since part of my faculty path was kind of taking biomechanics skills from other tissues and transitioning to them in a new area, I had a lot of synthesis just like that. So we had done like baseline ground zero sorts of like building a new mechanical testing device and fitting like an initial constitutive model. But everything we were proposing was a lot of kind of dynamic aspects after that. So I would say I had bare minimum amount of preliminary data, but then it was grounded in like expertise in other tissues to help build confidence.
Maybe opening this up to questions, because I know a couple of people ask about preliminary data. Is there anything that you all feel we could address or should address?
Sure. I have a question. May I ask? Hello, everyone. Thanks so much for the panelists for putting this together. So I had a general question. I submit my proposals in NIH. So I wanted to ask this question. Probably I've had the opportunity to submit to R21 Trailblazer as well. I want to compare R21 Trailblazer with the NSF CAREER, because both of them seems they're like sort of high impact, high risk, not that much of preliminary data for new investigators. So have you had a chance to submit, and can you compare these two together? I'm trying to calibrate myself with NSF proposals. I'm mainly NIH guy, but I don't know, how to basically compare.
So I'm gonna answer that one, and it's basically an R1. It's definitely not an R21. You want to basically, it's a big commitment, it's a big thing. And as I said, so the year I wrote my NSF, I wrote two R1s, 2 different projects. And one, I was writing for NSF that I wrote it to NIH, and then I dropped back to NSF. And it was basically, I think my NSF one turned out to be more massive than my R1, which, by the way, it did get funded as well. But so it was like, so it is comparable, right? They both got funded. But yes, it's definitely, you want to think R1 type for career.
And okay, that's like in terms of the amount of the work. How about the ambitious and innovative part?
Oh yeah, yeah. No, I mean it in every aspect. I mean amount of work. I mean amount of ambition, planning 5 years ahead. Actually, even more, right? Because even in your R1, you might be saying it's for 5 years, but this is my, central hypothesis. Like this is my overall goal, right? So like in your specific aims page of what you're trying to say, what you're doing, is very similar to my NSF career. This is what I want to do basically when I grow up. That's the same thing, just maybe a different word for R1, right? I just said in the scientific community, this is where I want to establish and clarify, blah, blah, blah. So no, definitely it's an R1 type mechanism, yeah.
Cool.
Yeah, I would piggyback on what Daniela said with what we said earlier, right? That I think in my mind, the one difference is like, or one of the, for the R21 and even like an R01 in some way, you're like how you're transforming the field. Whereas again, it needs to both transform the field and be the cornerstone for your career with your career trajectory, right? Of explicitly how it will catapult you forward and what you will plan to do for the next like 5 to 10 years that transforms all of engineering and mechanobiology, right? Not just like how it will get to humans in the clinic. Well, not just, but you know what I mean? Yeah.
Oh, perfect. Good to know. I had another like a quick question. So part of my work is experimental. I heard like fundamental science, it's very relevant to NIH. Again, I want to know once they say like fundamental science, how we can, how much they want like these fundamental things, because part of my work, I'm not that much relevant to this like BMMB, but because I develop like tools, fabricating like instruments, and I have biomechanics in it as well. So I wanted to know, once they say fundamental science, how much of that is like fundamental science, like in their mind, in the mind of reviewers, as compared to NIH?
I think it depends on your study section and your institute. So I know some people that submit to like the modeling and analysis of biological systems study section at the NIH have said you can write it like an NSF grant, whereas other things it's quite different. So I think my recommendation when you're asking those questions is whether it's BMMB or another place, they have a synopsis page, right? Like that's the same sort of thing at the NIH, right? And so you want to tailor and directly integrate that language into your what is it called, program, what do we call our aims page? I forgot, what's the title?
Overview, objectives and overview.
Oh, yeah, thanks. Objectives and overview, which can be over one page, right? But it just depends. Like, so again, you have to, if you develop tools, and that's probably an easy, perfect cell, there's a line on there explicitly has to be mechanics, right? So it has to be focused on the mechanics sort of side for BMMB, right? But if you can sell like, I'm going to do it, like develop this tool for this application that will map back to medicine this way, and it can help these other biological, mechanobiological problems, then that's a perfect fit, right? But I would say whatever institute or branch of the NSF you're looking for, one of the last steps of your kind of polish is to directly put that language into your grant, right?
Awesome. Thank you so much. I appreciate that.
One brief comment, something that I definitely did, and maybe a little too much, was I looked at past funded projects, and it really helps you kind of calibrate what people have done and obviously what reviewers have funded. Keep in mind, of course, that the panels change, right? So that's a little harder with the NSF than NIH funding, that you kind of have a high turnover. But that's definitely something I did, go through the NSF website and just search previously funded BMMB projects. From my personal perspective, and again, I could obviously be wrong, this is very anecdotal, I feel like BMMB is probably the closest to NIH from all the study or the programs at NSF that I've seen. And I feel like it's also reflected in the writing itself, in that I personally sort of proposed specific aims. I called them research objectives, but they were kind of specific aims. Well, I've seen friends of mine that submit to NSF and have submitted careers write in a very different style, people that do fluids or something that is not as bio or possibly medically related. Trevor, do you have any perspective on that, or nothing to add?
Yeah, I guess, one thing that caught my attention was that I do remember when I was writing the career, having that hard decision on, is it fundamental science? Like, how do I show that? And so what I did in my proposal was I gave a bit of a history on this kind of mechanics application in conventional materials and how it sort of changed the field in those different fields, and then where it was in biomaterials and how I was going to apply it. And so that gave me confidence that what I was doing was a real fundamental mechanics concept that hadn't been done before in bioengineering. And I think the reviewers saw that. I didn't get any issues about was it an important concept. And that was one thing, one of the comments is like when to submit or what's the right time. For me, it was, I wanted to know whether that main idea was going to pass the test. And so I submitted once I kind of got that idea out. I didn't think the grant was perfect, but I got reviews saying that the general idea was solid. And so then in my next revision, I felt like I could pour myself into that and do a better job. But I think kind of that little history lesson that I gave in the proposal helped me and helped the reviewers out.
I think, Trevor, you created a really nice transition. One of the questions that I had asked the panelists to answer is, what did you do differently between your first and second submission or third submission? Did you completely change everything? Or did you try to address the reviewers' questions? Or did you, rely on the panel being new and kind of just, rethought everything that you had worked on?
Yeah,
Kristin,
I guess
the odd one out here, given that you just got it right away.
For me, the basic questions that I really wanted to know was the fundamental science question, was that going to pass, and was my outreach component going to pass? And they both said those were solid, but they had a lot of other problems with my methods and basically the research side. So I just tried to address a lot of those questions. I kept the main concepts intact. And yeah, just kind of work through what they said and try to also talk to colleagues. But no, I didn't make a big change. I just tried to make everything I had better.
I would say that I spent time on the first and second trial. I probably spent a month, and that definitely shows. I basically, the third time actually did spend maybe 2 or 3 months on it, going back and forth and just polishing the ideas. It turned out that I have a couple colleagues here on my department that were also submitting. So the three of us created a sort of a schedule and said, we review each other's, really just like the first page and general feedback, but it just kept us. And one of my colleagues, as opposed to like me, that was more of a procrastinator, she gave us an early deadline. And so, I had like a month before it was due that I had a pretty finished draft. So I think that definitely helped. And I think that goes for every grant, basically. I mean, just spending the time, polishing the ideas, because a lot of times you write things, but there's not a common thread throughout. And I know there's often the question about, well, do you want your 3 aims or your 3 objectives to be dependent or not dependent? And it's really not the idea that they have to be dependent, but there has to be a story. There have to be within a theme, right? And so otherwise think about, well, why wouldn't this other, if it's very different, why wouldn't this other aim be in another grant, right? Or why would it has to be in this grant? So it's sort of, because really in a way, they're just supporting one central hypothesis. And so really just working and polishing it out was really what I think what did to me with my grant. I actually felt really well even when I submitted it, especially compared to the previous two that I really just spent. Actually, I think one of them was like maybe even 3 weeks, 2 weeks. So yeah.
I spent a good amount of time on my first one. Probably, I'm not, yeah. Anyways, and then I got secondary consideration on the first round. And as I said earlier, everybody kind of liked it, I guess, or at least I didn't have too big a problem with it. So I really felt like my main challenge was to make it more exciting. And so I would say 80% of my effort during the second round was to sort of highlight why this was important, how it applied to other areas, and how it could fundamentally change our understanding of systems rather than just thrombus, which is what I looked at. And I had more data. I had spent a lot of energy and time that previous year to have more data and sort of have nicer figures. And then I also polished it aesthetically a bit. Just, I think, very similar to what Daniela described, and as well as Trevor. I didn't change anything fundamentally, but I just worked sort of on the overall flow and story and aesthetics and included more data. Do we want to open this up for questions, maybe related to what we had just discussed?
Sorry, I have another question. Sorry, I'm asking a lot of questions.
Farshid, do you mind if we first check whether anybody else has questions, just to make sure that we're distributing this a little bit? Well, it sounds like, you know, you get your pick. Nobody else has questions.
Perfect, thank you. So another fundamental question, comparing NIH and NSF. So in NIH, they want each aim to be independent. So one of the proposals I submitted, I thought that they should be connected. Like a couple of them said, your aims are like interconnected, it shouldn't be. But I've heard in NSF, it's another story. They should be some sort of in series. I just wanted to, like series aims, like following after each other. Is that correct or not? I mean, because it's very important.
As I said, I think like if you compare my R01 and my NSF CAREER, all of them are sort of built into some level of story. They, you know, maybe they don't really depend on one data from one aim, doesn't depend on the data from the previous aim or anything like that, but maybe it's more about building up to verify the biggest question, right? So for instance, I do a lot of multi-skill modeling. So I do at different levels, right? But at the same time, I need to connect them because again, data from different, like an organ or tissue or cellular, they still need to inform each other and talk to each other. So I don't think that that's a good description or differentiation between an R1, NIH or NSF, because at the end of the day, it's all part of a, you know, one proposal, one idea, one central hypothesis.
Yeah, and I think what Kristin mentioned earlier about, you know, visualizing, creating that flow chart that shows the connectivity, that can kind of, you know, whether they're dependent or independent, it shows how things relate.
Yeah, so I agree with what everyone said. I can speak from my personal experience. So like my career award is very much interdependent aims as far as like collect experimental data, formulate a mathematical model. And then the third aim is like a combination of like, you know, running the model to predict and then experiments to see if you predicted it. Whereas I would be quite cautious and concerned about submitting something like that to the NIH, right, because of the high interdependency. That being said, even though I mentioned I probably had the lower bar of preliminary data, I did have enough preliminary data, right, to prove that like aim one was definitively feasible, right? And I had like preliminary modeling stuff, right? So like, I think you have to similarly have like that base competency, but from my personal experience, I felt that they're more open to interdependent aims if you have a strong story and preliminary data to back up that it can be accomplished. that being said, we all know how it goes. Sometimes it's just like, maybe I just got lucky and they got excited enough about my idea that they were willing to overlook that. Like that's, I don't know, right? We never know from that perspective, but that's, I've been told that on the NIH side too, of having, you know, people say, as long as you get them excited enough, like they'll, like that, so the excitement overshadows the weakness, right? So I think some of it's the same sort of story, but.
I'll definitely second Kristin on this one. Mine is definitely sequential. My objective 1 is to do the experiments. My objective 2 is to do the modeling. That 100% depends on the experiments. But I think just as in Kristin's case, I had collected quite a bit of the data, at least preliminarily. So I had graphs showing it. And I also addressed that dependency very clearly in my potential pitfalls, right? And I think demonstrating that you're aware of the dependence and that you have a strategy to address that as a potential issue, I think is key for someone to be like, okay, that's a mature, you know, scientist who recognizes that there may be an issue and is prepared to address it if it does arise. I had sort of one more prepared question, which was, how much feedback did you solicit? Or in other words, how many people read your proposal and to what extent? I'm going to start with me real quick in that I had nobody read it fully other than 2 of my friends that provided some feedback, especially on the overview page, but I don't think anybody ever saw my full proposal. And that's not what I recommend doing. But for me, I just happen to know that I didn't have a mentor who would read my entire proposal and provide significant feedback. That's sort of the sense that I got. And so I was like, instead of sending something out and then waiting a bunch, you know, in the meantime, not being able to work on it and then getting something back that's not that helpful, I decided to go that route. But I was wondering how the other panelists handled that, whether they got significant mentorship on this or how they worked through that.
I'll go, I guess. So I was really lucky at the beginning of my faculty position. That's somewhat similar to what Daniela mentioned earlier. I had 2 colleagues who were actually, you know, like friends, like from my grad school lineage, who were 1 and 2 years ahead of me respectively in their faculty positions. And when I first started, we basically had like a monthly meeting where we all shared like our specific aims or like overall objectives pages. And so that was really instrumental for my like early development, to have like a consistent time when like I had to have something and to get peer feedback. And we were all somewhat closely related, but in different applications. So it was great to have, from the NSF perspective in particular, of having people with like the similar technical expertise that could help from that perspective. So they help with the career. And then I guess to kind of contrast, what I would always do is send sections, you know what I mean? Like, so either just the objective sort of thing or kind of like the innovation or significance. I don't think anyone necessarily like 100% read like the approach sort of thing, right? But so that way you could work on like the other part while someone's giving you feedback on a chunk. And then I had one colleague at my institution who was a couple years ahead of me, who did actually read my entire proposal for me and give me his feedback. And he's actually like an optics person. So someone that could really help with kind of that interdisciplinary reviewer, if you will, and not a biomechanics person at all. So I did not have any senior faculty, but I had a lot of people who were just kind of a few years or one step ahead, who are willing to invest that time in me, that I really appreciated and was instrumental in fine tuning some of the language. And yeah.
Go ahead, Daniela.
Oh, okay. Oh, I was gonna say just one senior person read my full grant, and I think the main thing was just, does this follow? Does this read through? Is it clear? Kind of thing. Besides my colleagues, that in a way we were the blind guiding the blind, right? And so because it's your colleagues, and they also had at the point they had not gotten their NSF careers either. So, but 2 out of the 3 of us did get the NSF career. And so, I mean, it's always good to get feedback, somebody to read it and says, oh, does this make sense? Is this clear?
I only had a full-time grant reviewer that our college has on staff give mine a read and kind of give me advice on positioning and messaging. If I was done a month in advance, like Daniela. I would have probably had more people, but I think I was just about a few days away from submitting. So it's kind of last minute.
We have about 5 minutes left before the time is over. I do want to highlight that I have time afterwards. I'd be happy to stay on if that's helpful at all. I want to be clear, I don't expect that from the other panelists at all. But if you have any last questions, I think this would be a great time. And also just to reiterate, I'm going to send out the video afterwards if anybody missed anything. And also feel free to reach out with more questions afterwards.
Thank you very much. I had one question. Can you comment on the letter from the chair that you need to provide? Like, what are some critical elements you thought would boost your application?
And they're specific to these NSF CAREER one. They give you a specific list of things that they want you to address. So, I mean, it's pretty much a template set for you.
Yeah, I know for my letter, it was, I thought it was important that the department chair showed that they were supporting me with the startup package. Like they talked about that. They talked about the lab space. They confirmed that they would allow me to teach the course that I was proposing, and that they would, support basically all the endeavors of my grant. But I think just giving them, the reviewers, a good idea that I had a lot of monetary support from the university was helpful.
Yeah, I don't really have anything to add. I think it was articulated well, other than I guess everyone knows this, but they do have to attach it. I did have a friend with a horror story that their spa institution forgot to attach that letter, which means that your application gets bounced back. So if you need that planning early sort of aspect to make sure that all.
That's odd because I had to upload it, like in my application itself.
So it depends on your institution. Like Tulane is the same. I manually upload everything. This is the case with an institution that has support staff to do that for you, which sounds great unless this happens.
I see.
Any other last minute questions? Also, if it's helpful to people, I'd be super happy to sort of I guess, black out a couple of things in my proposal, but share that afterwards with people that reach out to me, which I think may be helpful for you to just kind of see how I spend my space, which is kind of the commodity, I guess, that we have to prioritize on. So if you reach out, I'll be happy to sort of black out sections that I think are particularly protective worthy in my proposal. Any other last minute questions before we lose our wonderful panelists?
I was just gonna mention that just go with your style. I know that even with the 3 group of faculty that I was working with, we all had our different ways of breaking it up and calling it. Some people had a very heavy preliminary section and then their new objectives. I like the per objective having preliminary data just because that's how it just felt more comfortable and more my style. And again, there's no rule in that sense. It's not as rigid in a way, which can be also scary as the NIH grants, like the R ones. But just, whatever your style is, and as long as you're fulfilling certain like sections, then just build your story how you feel comfortable.
All right. I really want to once again thank you all for being here. I know this is a crazy time and you don't need any more Zoom on your schedule, but here you are and I appreciate it. Also, many thanks to the panelists for whom that is true as well, who also, donated some of their attention by actually answering questions and checking on their reviews, etc. Anyway, so if you have questions, please reach out. I really want to pay back that good mojo that was sent my way before I submitted mine. And then I'm really excited to seeing y'all at in-person conferences sometime soon again.
Yeah.
Thank you. Much appreciated.
Thank you, Manuel.
Absolutely. Thank you.